अऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम अल्हम्दुलिल्लाहि रब्बिल आलमीन अर्रहमानिर रहीम मालिकि यौमिद्दीन इय्याका नअबुदु व इय्याका नस्तईन इहदिनस सिरातल मुस्तकीम सिरातल लज़ीना अनअमता अलैहिम गैरिल मग़ज़ूबि अलैहिम वलस्सालीन आमीन। Dr. Murad Hofmann, Professor Khurshid Ahmed, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcoming you once again at IPS is a great pleasure and honor for me. Being an academic institution dedicated to promote policy-oriented research, holding of dialogue in the form of seminars, workshops, and lectures is a routine practice at IPS, and therefore it's a regular part of our activities. However, today's program has a special significance for all of us. Most important is the fact that it is being held in memory of late Murad, who is one of the chief architects of Islamic movement, particularly in the West. A scholar of international repute, Murad authored more than 30 books related to contemporary Islamic movement and Islamic thought. His writings cover a wide range of issues having theoretical dimension as well as practical, and philosophical as well as strategic. He was particularly renowned for his command over sources of revealed knowledge as well as literature. He was member of the IPS governing body and academic council and was a real source of inspiration for all of us in the IPS. No doubt, we feel proud and privileged over his association with the IPS. The speaker today, Dr. Murad Hofmann, also adds a lot of significance to today's program. Educated at Harvard Law School and trained at Diplomatic School in Bonn, he has served as Director of NATO and Defense Affairs at the Foreign Office of Germany. He also served as Director Information for NATO at Brussels and German Ambassador to Algeria and Morocco. And in recognition of his services, he has been conferred several awards both as professional as well as an Islamic scholar. Indeed, with such a variety of experience and direct exposure to world politics as well as Islam, he is one of the most suitable person to dilate upon a subject related to Islam and the West. We are fortunate to have this opportunity of listening him today on Western apprehensions about Islam and Muslims' response. In the chair, we were expecting Dr. Mahmood Ahmad Ghazi, and still we are expecting he would be available. but at present he is in a meeting of National Security Council. As soon as that meeting is finished, we hope he would be here and join us. But we had, receiving that information, requested respected brother Dr. Zafar Ishaq Ansari, Chairman Islamic Research Institute, to preside over the function, and Alhamdulillah he is here and has acceded to our request. As regards to the format of the program, we shall begin with the IPS Chairman Rashid Ahmed making opening remarks, which will be followed by the lecture by Dr. Murad Hofmann, question answers, and then summing up by the chairman. In between, we shall be offering Maghrib prayer if the time comes for Maghrib. Now, with permission of the chair, I request Professor Khurshid to make opening remarks.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasul Kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Brother Chairman Dr. Zafar Ishaq Ansari, Distinguished Speaker Brother Dr. Murad Hofmann, respected Elder dear Brother Shafi, distinguished participants, friends, brothers and sisters in Islam. For me, it's not merely an opportunity to make a few submissions on the theme that is going to be addressed by an eminent scholar and poet, Dr. Murad. It's also a very personal and emotional moment. For Murad had been my dearest and closest colleague, brother, co-participant in the Islamic movement for half a century. Perhaps the only person I know of who was closer to him than me and whose contact with him was also earlier than mine is Dr. Ansari, who is chairing this meeting. From our early student days till he breathed his last, we had been together in our own way, trying to imbibe the Islamic message and to try to live and share it. As a person, as an intellectual, as a scholar, as one who held senior executive positions in Islamic movement and dozens of other allied research, educational institutions. Although a civil engineer by training and who rose to the height of the profession as a professional, last part of his life spent as resident director of ACE, looking after the development of the Haramain Sharafain, the mosque at Makkah and Medina. After which he joined me in Leicester in the Islamic Foundation. And for 10 years, day and night, he worked to promote Islamic movement. Came back to Pakistan until he breathed his last in December 1996, he was engaged in this. That's why this moment is a very emotional, personal moment for me. And we have the choice of organizing this in some prestigious place, and the follow-up programs of Dr. Hofmann would be in Lahore and Karachi. But we chose to hold this meeting, this initial lecture in the presence of the IBS, because this was built by us jointly as a place through which policy analysis from Islamic perspective could be developed and shared with you. Dr. Murad Hofmann is a very dear brother and friend. We have been in touch in a scale of time, a few years, but in a scale of understanding, there is a union between the souls and minds that joins us together. I regard him as one of the very resourceful enrichments of the Ummah from the German landscape. Muhammad Asad, Leopold Weiss, was my first contact Islamic scholar and Da'iyah from Germany. He and other colleagues like Aman, Ahmad von Riphah, and many more. Alhamdulillah, now is the galaxy. And we are proud to see them as members of our Islamic family. Dr. Hofmann, his doctoral research was on jurisprudence, particularly working on law of contempt of law, contempt of court, in the American and German legal traditions. In Foreign Office, his main interest had been, along with building bridges between human beings, countries and communities, in defense studies and nuclear non-proliferation and deterrence. He has served in the German Foreign Office, in NATO, and as ambassador of Germany, as Khalid told you, to Algeria and Morocco. And after retiring from diplomatic service, he is acting as ambassador of Islam all over the world. His main contributions had been in the German language, but he writes in English also directly. And most of the works have been published in English, some in French, in Arabic. Notes of Muslim was perhaps his first presentation. Islam the Alternative, another very thoughtful work. Road to Makkah, which gives recollections of his Umrah and Hajj, and the of Islam, Islamic message, and a lot of other books, and a series of articles produced in the common journals in parts of the world. We are very happy to have him as the first speaker for this annual series. He would be speaking on 3 themes during his stay in Pakistan, all related to the issue of Islam and the West. I do not want to preempt what he wants to say, nor would I like to constrain him. But just in a couple of minutes, I would like to suggest that Islam and the West perhaps is very much a formulation which has emanated from the West. Because West primarily is a geographic concept. Islam is not bound by geography or history. Islam is universal by definition. And East and West both are equal in the eyes of Islam, and the message of Islam is relevant to all parts of the world, and it's not a message from the East toward the West or vice versa. It is the message of Allah, who is Rabbul Alameen, Rabbul Mushtaqain, Rabbul Maghribain, to the entire humanity who live on the globe anywhere. Yet because of the peculiar situation in which we are during the last 5 centuries, this has become an issue. And this issue has many dimensions: civilizational, political, historical, economic, prospects of cooperation, clash of interests. To me, the most important dimension, however, is, and that's what I want to focus in my introductory remarks, while Muslims had been in all parts of the world, and in Europe, Muslim presence has been there from the very first century. In fact, the first Arab visitors to Spain were in year 27 of Hijrah. And before the close of the first century, Muslims were established in Spain. And when fall of Granada took place, in between there had been Muslim outreach in Italy and Sicily, and then Eastern Europe, going into Central Europe. And today we have over 30 million Muslims living in Europe. And if we include Turkey, which is on the verge of joining European community, then the Muslim population will increase to over 100 million. And it's not merely a question of Europe, even in America. North America, present Muslim population is over 6 billion. And another 5 to 6 billion on the Americas. Australia, New Zealand, even Iceland. So there is Muslim presence everywhere. So we can never think of West as something alien, something outside our domain, something beyond our interest. Because Muslims are in every part of the world. And our concern for humanity and for Muslims makes us interested in whole of the globe and not merely in this part or that part. So when we are talking of Islam and the West, perhaps it is only in the context of the current political and economic situation. And perhaps also at the intellectual, civilizational level, where somehow Western civilization, despite its global reach, because of its historic geographic origin, is more characterized by the West than the East. So at those two levels, definitely, there are problems. But here, when we talk of Western apprehensions, I, as one who comes from this part of the world, is forced to look upon it with a pinch of salt. Because in history we find that while there had been periods of rule by those who were foreign to a particular land. And even if we forget about the earlier civilizations, from Alexander to the contemporary colonial era, this type of rule has been a phenomenon. But it was only during the last few centuries of Western colonial rule, European colonial rule in particular, when a change took place in the nature of foreign rule. For the first time in human history, colonial or imperial rule meant a new type of relationship in which the mother country and the periphery were to be so related that resource transfer should take place from the colonized world to the colonizing world. This defines the imperial character, and a number of historians, particularly the work of John Kennedy on rise and fall of great powers, is very eloquent on this point, that this is the first time in human history when transfer of resources, when impoverishment of large parts of the world took place because of this colonial rule. So much so that if you look to the economic map of the world in the mid-18th century or even beginning of 18th century, the non-European world, the third world, the GDP was about 73% of the world GDP in the now third world countries. Europe had only 27% of the world GDP, and America had less than 1% of the GDP of the world in year 1800. Today, the position is that 87% of the world GDP is in the 22 developed countries of the world. Only 3 richest persons in the Western world own wealth more than the combined GDP of 48 countries of the world. This transfer of resources, economic, political, and then an effort to put barriers to transfer of technology, science and technology, sharing of knowledge, and along with that, an approach where countries with larger populations to be denied science, technology, knowledge, economy, but also population control, so that the global imbalance, because from history we know that countries with larger populations and with strong economies and knowledge have always dominated the world. Countries with smaller populations have controlled because of technology for short periods, but then things have changed. So that is the scenario in which the debate between Islam and the West presently is taking place. In that context, the Islamic world and the third world is the aggrieved world, is the aggrieved party, has been at the suffering end. Its resources has been depleted. Its energies have been sapped. Its talent has been benumbed. And a kind of an impoverishment of large segments of the world and enrichment of smaller segments has taken place. It is in that context that this dialogue is taking place. Also, particularly the shadow of the Crusades. Although I understand presently perhaps Pope is going to extend apology today in Egypt, if it is true, yet Crusades were wars unleashed by European powers, and the amount of atrocities committed, they know no bounds. But I think a still greater victim has been the truth, because during this period, false image building of Islam took place. Islam and Christianity both originated roughly in the same landscape. They had been living together. There had been a scholarly exchange of differences, criticisms, but never the type of maligning and demonization that has taken place in the intellectual realm, in the literary field, in the academic discourse, in the religious debate over this period. So we find that the Muslim world and Islam both, they have suffered because of that, and a false image has been built. And on the basis of that false image, Islam and Muslims are being presented as a threat. Although they are economically, politically, militarily, scientifically, technologically weak and divided, the GDP of all the Muslim countries taken together is almost equal to the GDP of Italy only. We have no land dispute with the West. Yet, demonization and presentation of Islam as a threat, and particularly after the fall of communism, a new enemy has been discovered. So I think some serious heart searching and soul searching is needed. And it is on the basis of truth and justice that we want a dialogue and understanding. Whole globe is one city. Whole humanity is one family despite the differences. And the fact of such a strong Muslim presence in the West means that we are not opposed to any land. Definitely there are differences on the civilizational level. In question of worldview, vision of society. And their differences are a blessing for mankind. Because it is through dialogue, through understanding, that we can learn the truth, share, and build a better world. Truth is not the property, the monopoly of this part of the world or that part of the world. It is the common legacy of mankind. Every evil has some positive aspect, and I am one of those who feel that while weapons of mass destruction have been a threat and a menace, yet they have paved the way for a balance of terror, which is acting as a deterrent to wars. And if humanity has been spared of another world war after 45, it has been because of that balance of power and that presence of deterrence. And it is my surmise that the next century would perhaps be spared of a global war, because that would mean global destruction. If we can be saved of war, then it means the competition would be in the field of ideas, manners and mores, civilization lifestyles, in the field of cultures, not clash of civilizations, but contact of civilizations, competition of civilizations. And that provides a great opportunity for mankind to draw upon the sources of goodness from wherever they are. So it is in this context that I would like to end on a positive note by sharing with you two quotations from Richard Nixon, who in his later days produced some very incisive works. The first quote I would like to give you from his book, Seize the Moment, America's Challenge in a One Superpower World, where on the one hand he accepts that no nation, not even communist China, have a more negative image in the American consciousness than those of the Muslim world. That is a reality. But then he comes to the conclusion, as we develop our policies to engage the Muslim world, we must begin with respect and understanding for peoples who feel that they have been misunderstood, discriminated against, and exploited by Western powers. We should not try to impose our values on them. Though the Muslim world lags behind the West in political development, only 2 Muslim nations have democratic governments. Our civilization is not inherently superior to theirs. The people of Muslim world were more resilient against the appeal of communism than those of the West. And their widespread rejection of materialism and moral permissiveness of Western culture redounds to their credit. And his last work, the Beyond Peace, he ends the discussion on a very positive note on which I would like to end my preliminary submissions. Nixon says, the 20th century has been a period of conflict between the West and the Muslim world. If we work together, we can make the 21st century not just a time of peace in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, but a century in which, beyond peace, 2 great civilizations will enrich each other and the rest of the world, not just by their arms and their wealth, but by the eternal appeal of their ideals. That, in my view, sets the agenda for the next century and the tone of the dialogue that should take place between the Islamic world, the Western world, in fact Islamic world and the rest. Let me conclude just by showing to you that we were trying to synchronize the beginning of this series with the publication of a posthumous work of Brother Khurram. These were his recollections of his life in the Islamic movement, Lamahat. I am happy to say that this work has seen the light of the day today. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillah. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Khurshid Sahab. I now request our learned speaker, Dr. Murad Hofmann, to present his lecture on Western apprehensions about Islam and Muslims' response. Dr. Murad Hofmann.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. As-salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi. Dear Professor Ahmad, dear Dr. Ansari, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and that I say to everybody. After 52 minutes of preliminary submissions, you are probably so tired that I can get away with anything I say. The topic you have asked me to address proceeds from a significant asymmetry. The West, basically a geographic concept, is set off against Islam, a religion. But this discrepancy makes good sense because the Occident can no longer be equated with religion. It is no longer essentially Christian, but rather the realm of agnosticism and atheism, professed or practiced, and of materialism and consumerism. Therefore, if there is a clash between these two civilizations, and ideologically there is a clash of ideas indeed, it is the confrontation between a world with transcendental links and one without. A world anchored in its belief in Allah Ta'ala and one fully absorbed in the consequences of its total disbelief. We have to keep these far-reaching facts in mind throughout this lecture, which is dedicated to a remarkable man with a remarkable mind, a model Muslim who was fully conscious of what was and is at stake for Islam at this juncture of history. I am talking of the late Khurram Murad, may Allah have mercy on him, one of Pakistan's greatest contributions to our beautiful faith. I strongly believe in the reality of what is called collective memory or collective consciousness. The history of the relationship between Occident and Islam is ample proof for that. We cannot understand the temporary misapprehensions of the West vis-à-vis Islam, and there is a forest of them, without knowing their historical roots, because this unfortunate past is still very much alive. As early as Islam began spreading, the Christian world around it followed John of Damascus' interpretation that this new religion was a hodgepodge, eclectic cocktail of misunderstood Judaism and Christian notions. Indeed, a Jewish-Christian heresy. In particular, they misunderstood the Israeliyat in the Quran as truncated biblical stories, whereas they are archetypal warnings independent of historical context. Therefore, still today, the West considers its civilization as Judeo-Christian, while in fact it is Judeo-Christian Muslim. And it is that in content and in form, given the enormous but stubbornly neglected Islamic heritage in Western philosophy, science, mathematics, and art. To be brief, it is still not considered a lack of education not to know anything about Islam. A second major apprehension has to do with the incredible speed with which Islam spread from the Arab Peninsula all the way to Spain and to India. We, the Muslims, know that this was not achieved, as Westerners still claim, by fire and the sword, but on the whole remarkably peacefully, and that for three reasons. Many of the Christians encountered were so-called monophysicists, one sort of the other, like Arian Christians, Nestorian, and Copts, who, like the Muslim conquerors, also did not believe in the divine nature or the double nature of Jesus. These people welcomed the much less suppressive Muslim rule and its non-arbitrary taxation. With Islam came to them what we call today the rule of law, also in warfare. Mainstream Christians could not see things this way, of course. In order to save their self-esteem, they had to demonize Islam through developing legends, some of which are still today with us. For instance, that Islam is an aggressive religion, called by Max Weber a war religion, in pursuit of sacred war. The Prophet of Islam, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was denigrated like no other major historical figure in history, before or after, as a bloodthirsty, lustful impostor, possibly even a renegade cardinal of the Eastern Church. Fantastic as it may sound, all of these dirty allegations are with us today, visible in every allegation of so-called Islamic terrorism and in every attack on Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as it culminated in Salman Rushdie's infamous book. The demonization of our Prophet was such that the Catholic Church, in spite of recognizing Islam as a way to salvation in 1965, still refuses to accept Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as the guide on that road to salvation. Which implies, of course, that the Quran, Kalimat Allah, is still not accepted as a holy script. There too we are talking of a third misconception which determines the present. The Quran was first translated into a European language, Latin that is, in the 12th century Toledo in Spain for the Abbey of Cluny in France, Peter the Venerable. He, however, did not want to be informed about Islam. On the contrary, he needed this translation for his propaganda war against Islam. In fact, the Crusaders were motivated for their risky journey by being told that the Muslims believed that there is no God but Muhammad. One consequence of this equation was that the Muslims were and still are called Mohammedans, and that the British in India collected Mohammedan law. Peter's translation was printed only 400 years later, exactly 400 years later in Basel, and that at the instigation of no one less than Martin Luther. In those days, Islam appeared in Europe under the guise of Ottoman campaigns directed against Vienna. For Luther, the Turks were an instrument of God to punish the Pope and all Catholicism with it for their corruption of the Christian faith. In fact, subsequent translations of the Quran into the German language all made reference to the Turks and to their military threat. Some were called the Turkish Bible, others were called Al-Quran or the Turkish Law and Misconceptions. Consequently, to this day, Islam is frequently perceived by Westerners as a threat, even by Samuel Huntington, who knows very well that modernization can happen without Westernization, and that the West cannot serve as a universal model. When in the clash of civilizations he talks of bloody borders with Islam, he does so in a defensive spirit, trying to save Fortress America from invading Muslim hordes. This misconception, fear and anxiety of being run over by Islam, being highly emotional, is one of the hardest misconceptions to eradicate. We have now arrived at the 18th century, a bit after Descartes, in the so-called age of enlightenment, which is very much with us today as project modernity and as all-pervasive secularism, an ideology recently well analyzed by Professor Khurshid Ahmad in Encounters. At that time, the Christian churches, Catholic and Protestant alike, continued to stifle progress and free inquiry in all fields. People lived in dynastic theocracies which nourished clerical abuse and obscurantism way beyond the Renaissance. It was therefore extremely courageous and beneficial for Europe that intellectual giants like Immanuel Kant, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Frederick the Great, and also the German poet Goethe, liberated the European mind from ecclesiastical oppression. All these people, church-independent deists or Unitarians, without thinking of becoming Muslims, were greatly impressed by Islam because of its concept of Tawheed and its absence of clergy, pope, and sacraments. They nevertheless criticized Islam unfairly, but did so in order really to attack the Christian churches, indirectly and without risk, a procedure for which Islam is still paying the price. Ever since, in the West, man and his rationality have been considered autonomous. Man dethroned God by proclaiming himself the measure of all things. Religion increasingly became a private affair, more and more replaced by natural sciences, which in turn, as scientism and rationalism, turned into pseudo-religion. After Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, and Friedrich Nietzsche, religion was relegated to the realm of myth, legend, superstition, something for the less than intelligent, to fade away gradually as humanity progressed. By the end of the 19th century, Nietzsche was able to declare in writing that God is dead. Identification with this project modernity is incredibly tenacious in spite of its dismal failure. The Age of Reason, now 200 years old, produced innumerable wars, including the two most savage ones the world has ever seen, during which devastating chemical and nuclear weapons were used and carpet bombing indiscriminately. Slave trading, concentration camps, the mass extermination of Jews, gypsies, and the mentally sick, Stalinists' purchase of millions of innocent people, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, in Bosnia, Kosovo, Chechnya, you name it, all these atrocities were committed during the Age of Reason, which had promised nothing but humanitarian progress, welfare, and liberty. And by the way, none of these atrocities happened in the Muslim world. If you assume that these tremendous shortcomings created any real doubt about the superiority of the Western model, you are mistaken. On the contrary, after the collapse of communism, the feeling of being the logical and unsurpassable end of history even turned into cultural triumphalism. This is odd, given indeed incisive 20th century developments, particularly in physics, biochemistry, and cosmology. Whereas the 19th century was convinced that one could unravel the laws of the universe, scientists have become much more modest in the 20th century. In fact, 100 years after Max Planck, Albert Einstein, and Werner Heisenberg, we still do not know what matter is, what light is, what gives mass its propensity, how life comes about, what produces consciousness, how the universe began and how it might end. Nor do we understand time or energy or even the force of gravity. It all remains a riddle, which means that Einstein's famous equation E is m times c square really means nothing, because we do not really know any of its components. There again, you might think that the average European by now realized that matter having vanished in modern post-Newton physics, there is room for a spiritual world and God. That supposition again would be wrong. All that has filtered down to the average Westerner in the crudest possible way is that everything is relative. The conclusion drawn from this Einstein travesty are fatal. The postmodern creed indeed reads, everything goes. Don't pass any value judgments, have fun, and do your own thing. That is bad enough for somebody like us attached to permanent values. But worse, the postmodern world holds on to most of the convictions of modernity, in particular the notion that there is no God because there is no way of proving it. And this is crucial for our topic. We have to be aware that Immanuel Kant, in his world-famous Critique of Pure Reason, established once and for all, a bit like Al-Ash'ari 800 years earlier, that the pursuit of metaphysic leads nowhere. Our logic, depending on our sensual perception, is incapable of drawing valid conclusions as to the unseen, al-ghaib. Ludwig Wittgenstein, during the 20th century, reaffirmed Kant through his linguistic critique of metaphysical inquiry, showing that metaphysics at best is a human language game. Muslims can sympathize with these views. Do we not believe in the necessity of divine revelation exactly because we know that we cannot arrive at truth without it? When dealing with Allah's second mode of manifestation, the universe, The Quran tells us that on the earth are signs for those of assured faith. This means that the observation of God's creation can reaffirm the faith of those already convinced of God's existence. Indeed, if the observation of nature imposed faith, instead of legions of them, there would not be a single God-denying scientist around. The trouble begins when, in view of the impossibility of reliable metaphysics, people opt for the assumption that God does not exist, passing from the intelligent position of agnosticism to the stupid position of atheism. That, however, is very frequently the case in Europe. People cannot stand uncertainty, keeping belief and non-belief in balance. So in practice, they become atheists. Any form of religion is dreaded by them as a return to obscurantism, oppressive, intolerant European Middle Ages, as a threat to all that modernity stands for. This phobia is further increased by the fears that a Muslim majority somewhere in the West, due to the large growth rates of Muslim families, would automatically lead to a significant drop in the quality of life. The West is, of course, structurally addicted to things that Islam forbids. Nicotine abuse, alcohol, pornography, illicit sex, passionate music, child abortion, and homosexuality as an alternative lifestyle. In view of this, Islam is dreaded as a fun-denying, rigid Puritanism. To put it in banal terms, our dawah problem with such people is not their defense of the Christian dogma of Trinity. They could not care less. What they defend, nails and teeth, are their pork chops, accompanied by a mug of strong beer and the girlfriend in their arm. There are other misconceptions, like the idea that Islam is rights, regardless how little and selectively human rights are applied, for instance in Kashmir, in Palestine, or in Chechnya. Problematic is here the Western conviction that nobody else had human rights before they were first proclaimed in Britain, the United States, and France. The Sharia, in particular, is therefore classified people whose law is barbaric. Alhamdulillah, in the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, to name a few countries, even single convert to Islam than men. In view of that, it is clear on the whole, are the most passionate enemies of Islam imaginable. This is due to the misconception at best and slavery at worst. Of course, there is no smoke without fire. You all know that Muslim men, often with a macho mentality, have interpreted the Quran and Sunnah for 1420 years in their own way. If women were accorded their Quranic rights, we would not have the formidable misconception, absurd as it may seem, is connected to two related ones. Are simultaneously accused of being too licentious and too restrictive field. On the one hand, their own cultural stereotyping, and secretly envy Muslim men for their of Oriental nights, belly dancing, performed by semi-naked odalisques, are projected on to the Muslim world. On the other, women in public cover themselves decently, like Christian nuns do, and oppose such walking morale reproaches. Any other, so there is some time left addressing Islamic response to them. It must become clear that nobody who is aware of these cultural constellations can perform full dawah. I'm therefore convinced that in each age dawah must be conducted by Muslims born or raised in that particular civilization. One must know how people tick if one is to make them tick differently. Organized around ethnical, linguistic, even sectarian criteria, like Deoband or Barelvi, Bradford, or like Church or other. My second point is seemingly simple. When you have so many prejudices against you, the best way of them to follow a proactive line, reactive. Simply to live Islam fully in the middle of the West, no more and no less. Move. Immigrant Muslims become a living contradiction of what they are. After for a time, hands are chopped off, children are clean, show civic concern, and alcohol is really present. We people become curious and then appreciate reason to give lectures on the and culture of medieval Andalusia. It's much less promising lectures in Islam, the like. Also not fall into the trap of treating the ethical West Christian, blaming Christianity for all shortcomings encountered there. It is that Americans, as a rule, are still church-going. It's politically correct. But Europe has become de-Christianized to a frightening degree. Frightening because dawah is much easier with people who at least believe in the al-akhirah. In fact, Muslims should convince Christians that they are sitting in the same boat, floating on an atheist ocean that seems constantly increasing in size. Addressing now the contents of the Islamic response, I cannot stress enough that we must keep in mind the Western philosophical training as explained earlier. This means that we must first deal with the existence of God before we can argue on the basis of His book. Otherwise, we will be dismissed as unserious. Now, as I explained, we cannot hope to be heard with so-called proof of God, be they based on causality, ontology, or history. But we can make decisive inroads by arguing on the basis of scientific probability, claiming that the observation of nature makes it highly improbable that God does not exist. This is the approach taken by the British scientist, philosopher Richard Swinburne in his famous book on the existence of God. Only then can we point out that it is neither rational nor prudent to deny the existence of God, drawing perhaps on Pascal's famous wager, and to show that rationalism has led mankind to the brink of global disaster. Thanks to highly sensitive Westerners like Daniel Bell from Harvard and William Ophüls, we can refer to symptoms of a deep civilizationary crisis of the Occident. Destruction of the family, spreading of drugs and violence, overall cooling of social relations, survival threatening damages to the environment, nuclear devastations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here we might ironically ask whether these cities have been destroyed by a Christian bomb, since the Pakistani nuclear device is called Islamic. The idea is not need for toleration in Dawah. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German poet, wrote, I quote, "Tolerance can only be a transitional attitude, leading to acceptance. Merely putting up with someone means hating him." That's what he wrote. This movement in the West, rather than pleading acceptance, should now be assertive enough to present Islam as alternative, indeed as the very medicament the West badly needs if it will survive as a civilization. In other words, let us present Islam as a contribution, as something we offer to the solution of the West's most intricate problems, to help the Occident regain intact faiths, respectful children, brotherhood, racial tolerance, soberness, stress, stability, respect of life, patience, and social defense aids. Let us present Islam as a means of repairing the fabric of society. People are online, yes, but alone. Almost so. Afro-Muslims in America were able to clean up drug in neighborhoods, simply practicing Islam, and have more to abolish the image of Islam in America than many a preacher around. This being said, however, avoid counting on these issues of democracy, human rights. This is of all that Muslims are pretending was incompatible with Sheikh Yusuf al-, the democracy belief and battle of both Islam and democracy. Let us make the best of it. Ammar and Azhar were the first freely elected state in human history. Remember that our Prophet ﷺ, before the against his own better tactical, abided by the Shura. Let us be confident that also Western democracies not leave everything up for a decision. Their constitutions all contain and cannot be changed even by majority. In our case, that would be the Quran. So let us not democracy ideologically, but for what it is, a mechanism for the control of those in power. And also Muslims in power have to be controlled. As far as rights are concerned, we have to damage done. Absence of Muslim from the entire. Understandable that Islam would not distinguish between divine legal norms of higher rank. Muslims be expected the notion that the seat of right, since all rights are conferred by Allah. Nevertheless, it would have been easy to demonstrate that the Quran safeguards core human. For instance, the Quran outlaws comparing the murder of one person to some all of mankind. Does this not amount as a legal reflex to a human right to life? Theft is heavily punished. Does not amount to a human right to property? As far as women are concerned, I'm afraid that some of my fellow will have to live up to certain unpleasant truths, to wit, half of the world's population women. A civilization with to tap the talent of its women will lose out. The tradition of harem, Islamic. There is no valid basis for veiling faces. Let me be more specific. One would imagine that if you know An-Nisa 3, that you are all conscious of the fact that this verse dealing with polygyny is found within a chapter dealing with orphans. Well, why then do men so often fail to quote An-Nisa 3 from its beginning? Why do they pretend that the verse squarely says, marry women of your choice, 2, 3, or 4, neglecting the opening clause? If you fear, you will not be able to do justice to the orphan. Why do men behave as if they knew better than Allah by disregarding verse 129 of the same surah, which says, you will never be able to be fair and just to your women, even if you ardently desire it? How come many of those men who claim to follow the sunnah batter their wives on the basis of An-Nisa 34, knowing very well that their prophet never beat one of his women? Men begin to understand that Ar-Rijal Qawwamuna 'ala Nisa in that verse does not mean putting men above women status-wise, but in front of them protectively. When will men realize that Al-Baqarah 228 does not confer superiority on men, but only deals with the technicality of the law of divorce? I have mentioned fears caused by the assumption that Muslim majority in a Western country would impose a puritanical regime outlawing alcohol and pork for Christian even. In view of this, it is of the essence that Muslims acquaint their non-Muslim neighbors with the guarantee of religious pluralism in Islam. The problem is that the West, having physically eliminated all other religions, virtually remained mono-religious during the last 500 years, ever since the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain. This reflected, of course, the Catholic dogma, extra ecclesiam nullum salus, there is no salvation outside the church, and the fateful agreement between Protestants and Catholics in Germany, called cuius regio eius regio, meaning who is the boss determines the religion. Therefore, Westerners automatically assume that Muslims in the West, if only could, would impose Islam by force. It is thus necessary to point out in Awwa that the Islamic world, prominent in Egypt, the Lebanon, and the entire former Ottoman Empire, has always been characterized by what one can only call religious pluralism. In this respect, we must make the most of Al-Ma'idah 48. That verse is virtually a manifesto of religious pluralism, hard to believe for both Christians and atheists. For each of you we prescribed a law and a way. If Allah had so willed, He would have made of you one single community, but He wants to test you in what He has given you. So compete with each other. Good deeds. To Allah you will all return. He will inform you about matters which you use to dispute. When we quote that, we do not imply that all religions are equally right and equally wrong, but we accept that religion is without some facets of truth, and that, as Sufi knew all along, there are different ways for people to reach God. Islam is the religion with the highest content of gold, so to speak. Among other religions, there may be less than 24 carats. But we cannot deny there is gold in other places as well. Let me close with a second one of how not to respond. Some Western emigre Oriental Muslims are so eager to make Islam acceptable that instead of Islamizing the West, they are ending up Westernizing Islam. The end result of it is called Euro-Islam, a religion with a lot of Euro and little Islam. This idea is promoted mostly by what we call cultural Muslims, that is, people who pray, do not fast, do not go on pilgrimage, but are fond to claim Allah is in their hearts. You can't imagine how much damage is done by such people to dawah, because governments are turning to us saying, why can't you be as reasonable as these other Muslims there? This then is what came to my mind on the issue of Western misconceptions about Islam and Islam's most promising responses. Let me assure you that it has been a very great pleasure pleasure and an even greater honor to speak in a country which enabled the entire Muslim world by giving a home to Muhammad Assad and by producing people of great piety like Abu Ala al-Dudi and Murad, and lending us in the West, at least for a while, people of genius like Muhammad Iqbal and Fazlur Rahman. Allah bless